Hello everybody, this is Shane from Shane's Books and Review, and I hope that you are having a great day today. Today we are going to be talking about The Hound of the Baskervilles, wrote by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, circa 1905. There's been a lot of movies or TV shows or insert random media here that has took The Hounds of the Baskervilles and changed it, mutated it, made it into things that it really isn't. One of them, I think I remember, it was the guy was dressing up as a hound and going and killing people and eating them, which was disturbing on its own right. But anyway, long of it all is, I was so delightfully surprised whenever I read the book and found that the book wasn't anything like any of the portrayals I had seen of the subject matter in this book. That was a really cool thing for me at that point. And before starting today's video, I want to say one thing. In the last book of his that I read, it was The Final Problem. And in The Final Problem, Sherlock meets his untimely demise by the hands of his nemesis, Professor Moriarty. I found that it was fairly interesting that the device that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used to get around the death of Sherlock was to use Watson pretty much as a patsy. But it's already been established in the books that Watson is taking notes and is recreating some of the cases for the enjoyment of people and for the study of people, almost acting like a historian in a way. And so it only seems natural that Watson would be the device for that. Now, please remember before you tear me apart that I've not read all the Sherlock books. In the beginning of The Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson and Sherlock go back to their flat at Baker Street and find a cane instead of a note. So ensues them doing some deductions to figure out who the cane might belong to, and there's a sorted amount of clues there, such as the way that the thing was worn or used, initials on it, time periods given. Sherlock puts it to Watson to figure out who the individual is by just using the clues on the stick, and Watson, for his poor little self, does a pretty good job of figuring out the who. He doesn't quite get there with his deductions, but towards the end of them and their banter back and forth, he does pull a medical listing that doctors would have during that time period and finds the gentleman's name, according to what they have figured out. At this point, I thought that Watson was going to get his very first true compliment from Sherlock, but no, it was done in that very Sherlockian way of under the boards, and no, it's really not a compliment. But I think it's meant as a compliment. Sometimes Sherlock does come off a little bit as a rear end, but that's one of the reasons why he's enjoyable too. During their postulations about the stick and where it came from, they've come to the conclusion that the guy must be forgetful. He's probably a little bit lazy or just not wanting to try so hard. And then he's got a dog. And it was at that point where Sherlock was standing in front of the window and has a small eureka moment. And he calls out what kind of a dog it is. And Watson's mind is blown, because how could he know just from the teeth marks exactly what kind of a dog it is? Well, it turns out the dog and the owner of the dog are standing outside waiting to get in. Now enters Dr. James Mortimer. Dr. James Mortimer has something to tell Sherlock and Watson about a good friend of his, Charles Baskervilles. Charles Baskervilles apparently came to an unhappy and untimely end. He was attacked by a ferocious spectral hound, and in front of several people was killed. His throat was ripped out. This occurred on the Devonshire estates. At this point, Dr. Mortimer and Sherlock, along with Watson, discuss aspects of the case of who was there, what detective, what was found, what wasn't found, and Jimmy Boy, as it were, finally decides to let somebody know about the footprints, or paw prints, really, that he saw nearly 20 to 50 yards away from the body, and how nobody seemed to see it. There's also a side note to make here. James has a really odd fascination on the skull cap of Sherlock. It was unique, though, to see Sherlock have his big old feelings hurt for a change whenever he asks, oh yeah, well, I must be the greatest, and that's the reason why you want to take a look at my skull. I can appreciate your enthusiasm because it matches my own and the things that I'm interested in. And then he quickly gets shot down. He's like, no, this other guy is like the best, and but that's in his field. The peacock had a wing clipped on that one. Dr. James Mortimer expresses his worry and angst about the nephew of Charles Baskervilles. The nephew being Henry Baskervilles. He seems to be the sole inheritor of the entire Baskervilles estate. And as James put it, a lot of the family has had issues with surviving, and a lot of them go out in a really bad way. And it'd be a shame for this young kid who's coming in to meet such a short end, if there is something to it. He also told them about the almost curse that's on that family, which I did mention, but it had to do with in the English Civil War era, when one of his ancestors, Hugo Baskerville, apparently made a deal with the devil in order to secure a woman that he had some wiles over. It's questionable on if he got her or not. I'm sure that if the deal was sealed, then he did. Then he was killed by a spectral hound from hell. Yes, indeed. At this point, I need to say something, and it's just a small side rail, so it's not a big deal. In a lot of the books that I like to read, sci-fi, thriller, horror, detective books, especially the later works, there's not a whole lot of really good description. People really don't wax poetic in their descriptions of things. Either they will tell you incredibly too much detail about what they're looking at, or they won't give you enough for your brain to be able to make its own imagery as you're reading. And that is one of the reasons why I find myself enjoying reading Arthur Conan Doyle, because his descriptions, they're really broad, but they're not too big. It's the use of language that you don't see much these days, and it's almost become a treat to me. That's one of the reasons why I enjoy going back to his books again and again and again. And so Sherlock and Watson agree to meet with Henry at their flat. Upon meeting with Henry, things seem to be much in disarray. Henry has come in from Canada recently and is trying to get himself established. During that time period, there's a debacle with boots. There's a big scene about the boots. Missing boot here, boot found after Sherlock and Watson and Henry have a sit-down meeting at a luncheon. And I believe it was during that luncheon that Henry shares a little bit of the family history. There's Charles, a middle brother that I think wasn't named, and then Roger, which was the youngest. Roger was thought to have been killed while traveling abroad. So that means that everything comes down to Henry. After the boot debacle, there was also this note that Henry brought up to Watson and Sherlock, and it shows them that it's a cut and paste type of a note, like in a TV show where the letters have been cut out of different newspapers, etc. And Sherlock, of course, does his thing and says, well, this must be from an educated individual and someone that's afraid that his handwriting will be highly noticed. They were like, well, why would it be from an educated man? Why would it be somebody that was learned? Sherlock points out, well, these fonts, and this is from this specific newspaper that only somebody that was high to do would actually have in their possession. Which, okay, I kind of get that. Right before departure, Henry shares with Sherlock and Watson that it is indeed his plan to move into Baskervilles Hall, despite the ominous warnings from multiple people and with a history of the place. I think that place was in his family for nearly 500 years. Upon the conclusion of this meeting at their flat at Baker Street, they notice that there's this bearded man that is following after Henry. They try to follow him, but eventually get made. He escapes in a cab. This is the second time where Sherlock, in this book, tells Watson, hey, if you're really my friend, what you'll do here is instead of glorifying this moment, show it for what it is. It was my failure. I should have been smarter. I should have done this. I should have done this. When Watson asks Sherlock, well, how do you mean? And Sherlock explains his logic of, I should have seen this happening. I should have, instead of going forward with it, turned and got into my own cab. The cab got there and he went to get into it. He asked who the person was that had gotten in. He was given the name Sherlock Holmes instead. So at this point, Sherlock started to figure that maybe things were a little bit deeper than what they appeared, that there might be more than what was on the surface. Here comes the misdirection. It was a pleasant amount. There was good hints and fills and this, that, and the other, but also the book got wrapped up really well. 2, because a lot of those loose ends all neatly fit together in the last bit of the book, really. Because Sherlock was so tied up with other things that was going on and his own loose ends and some of the things that could have been cases he was working on, he sends Watson ahead to Baskerville Hall. He tasked Watson to send information and notes about the caretakers, groundkeepers, housekeepers, butlers, neighbors, etc., anything and everything. It seems that perhaps Barrymore, which was the butler, and his wife, which was the housekeeper, are becoming suspicious individuals. There's a lot of odd behavior from him and her. This really does get Sherlock's interest as well as Watson's interest. During the time period when Watson is sending all this information back to Sherlock, he also finds a Mr. Stapleton and his sister living fairly nearby. This is an eccentric gentleman. Mr. Stapleton is a naturalist. He likes to be nude, which go him to be that free, right? While visiting with the Stapletons, there was a sound, an animal sound, a howl, a growl, a massive type of a sound, which was just almost immediately dismissed. So that was kind of curious too, considering what was happening with what they were investigating. Barrymore is, of course, becoming more and more suspicious because he was found with a candle in an empty room in the middle of the night and wouldn't answer what was going on. Well, that does kind of get all tied up. Upon Sherlock's arrival to Baskervilles Hall, there seems to be some conversation about an escaped murderer that was on the loose, Selden. And it's starting to look like perhaps it's Selden that is the culprit behind all the murders. Upon Sherlock's arrival to Baskervilles Hall, seeing Stapleton, he notices that there's a very large resemblance in between Hugo Baskerville and the Stapleton character. Things do progress, and Henry goes for a dinner over at the Stapletons. As Watson and Sherlock are going to the Stapletons to chat with him, they come across a horrible scene of a large animal attacking Henry, eventually shoot it dead. And everything was explained at this point kind of about this hound. After some detective work, they find out that this animal, of course they knew it was a dog, but they found out that it was a mixture between a bloodhound and a mastiff, and it was kept ravenous most of its life, barely fed, just ill-tempered altogether. That was the reason why the boot was so important, and why not just the new boot, but a different boot was needed. It accounted for the size that a couple of the people had told them about when they saw this thing chasing after Charles. As far as it being a spectral animal from the nether regions of hell itself, no, it was just phosphorus paint to make the animal glow. As everything starts to come together fairly nice and neatly, we find out that the murderer that had escaped Selden was Barrymore's wife's brother. They were trying to help him escape because they felt he was falsely accused. There was a deal that was actually struck up that would allow him to flee the country. But on the fated night that he was going to escape, he fell off of a cliff, which did free up the suspicion from the Barrymores. Poor Selden, that had been given the clothes of Henry, was attacked and killed by the animal, instead of him actually falling off of a cliff. And Holmes' original suspicions about this being something that runs incredibly deep was set to be true. There was a lot of foreknowledge of the family's history that wasn't readily easily explained until everything clicked. Stapleton wasn't Stapleton. Stapleton's sister wasn't his sister. And his name wasn't Stapleton at all. In fact, his name was Roger Baskerville. He was the son of the original Roger Baskerville that had come up missing. Sherlock and Watson formulated that Roger/Stapleton was trying to root out all of his competition to the family estates and all that would come with them. And it really was a good read. Would I recommend you getting it? Most certainly. I do want to say this though. I know that not everybody is going to want to do things the way that I do them, so if I were to, in the Sherlock books that I've read so far, say, hey, check this one out as your first one, then I would say read this one first. You won't be disappointed. If you're new to Sherlock, it will be an interesting book to read for sure. You will get to see some of his methodology. You'll get to see some of his detectiveness, if detectiveness is actually a word. And on top of all that, it's really a solid story. It's really good. And so it is that time. Yes, you made it. You got all the way through it. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, you are awesome. Again, today's book has been The Baskerville Hounds by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If you saw anything in this video that you enjoyed or that you liked, or you think somebody else might like, please feel free to share it. Send it on out. I would, however, like to know what you think about this book. I know what I think, but I'm curious to see your take on it. Was it a strong book? Was it not a strong book? Did you enjoy it? Let's start a discussion down below. If you happen to be new here, we would love to have you join the family. Please click that subscribe button. Should be right in here. Of course, my subscribe buttons do absolutely nothing. You need to look for the one down below. If you do subscribe today, please don't forget about turning on those notifications. That way you know when the next video comes out. Again, this has been Shane with Shane's Books and Review. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you in the next video.